现在有请香港岭南大学图书馆馆长郑瑞琼女士主持主题3：存取与储存共享纸本与数码馆藏的尖端方法。有请郑女士。
Good morning. The 4 presentation this morning comes from 4 countries and representing 3 continents. Our first speaker, Ms. Laine FARLEY, is the Executive Director of California Digital Libraries. She has been with the CDL since its inception in 1997 and assumed the position of Executive Director in 2008. Previously, her roles at the CDL have included positions as Director of Digital Library Services and Deputy University Librarian. Laine has a special interest in identifying emerging service needs in support of scholarship in the digital realm and developing innovative solutions that blend traditional and new services environment. As we focus on the collaborative collections, we need to ask ourselves some questions. How far are libraries really prepared to go in surrendering their collection to collaborative management? Are there opportunities for delivering better services to users, and how can they be evaluated? So now let's welcome Ms. FARLEY.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me do a little sound check. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay, good. Well, it's certainly an honor for me to be here to speak to you today, and I want to thank, in particular, my colleague and friend, Diane Perushek, for inviting me and introducing me to so many of you, and to say once again what a superb job the organizing committee has done with this conference. It's really just so impressive, as well as our host here at the university. I was here in Hong Kong about 10 years ago, and I was commenting to Louise last night that at the time I remember thinking these libraries are very competitive with each other. But today I think it feels a lot more collaborative, and so I guess that's a good thing. It's certainly a sign of the times that we all need to collaborate more. But as Rachel mentioned, sharing our collections in a deep way is still somewhat of a challenge. It's one of the more difficult areas for us to think about. But nonetheless, a new era for libraries in sharing and collection management has begun, driven in part by challenges around space, the advent of digital copies, and even some new opportunities for analyzing our collections. So what I thought I would do is see if I could think about these types of initiatives and come up with kind of a framework or even a sort of a scaffolding that we might think about as we look at these different kinds of initiatives. So I'm going to go through these areas today briefly, and then I'm going to leave you with probably more questions than answers, and we'll see if some of the other speakers may be able to help us answer those questions. So let me give you a little bit of context. I don't have a slide about the California Digital Library because this isn't a talk about the California Digital Library, but just to explain how we fit into the picture. CDL is one of 11 libraries at the University of California, and we're considered the 11th library even though we're not on a campus. We provide about 20 services, many of them have won awards, in fact, to the campuses. So we're both a peer and a shared service provider. The University of California has had 2 shared storage facilities since the 1980s. We have been involved in validating JSTOR titles for a DIM archive that will be shared. The UC libraries are the second largest contributor to Hottie Trust that you heard about yesterday from our CIC colleagues. And the California Digital Library also manages the shared print program for UC. And you might say, well, why does the digital library manage a print program? But it's been part of our charge from the beginning to help bridge digital and print collections. So this slide is about WEST, and that's another part of the context that I need to explain. This is the Western Regional Storage Trust. And it is a collaboration around retrospective print journal archiving. It involves over 100 libraries in the western U.S., and this is a very loose definition of the West, west of the Mississippi. It includes 3 library consortia, including UC, which is not exactly a consortium, but we operate in some ways like a consortium. We're actually more like a family, for better or worse. It has libraries of all sizes. Some are privately funded and some are publicly funded. So I'm going to refer to West as examples throughout looking at this framework. So goals, obviously the place to start if you're considering some kind of shared collection initiative. And I took a look at our CIC colleagues' website to see what they said about their goals. And you may be able to read this, but I'll highlight the main things they're talking about here. First and foremost, to preserve their resources, to ensure access, to realize economies of scale, to reclaim resources, and that might be space, but it might be staff time or other types of resources. And this last one I thought was rather interesting, to integrate the CIC libraries into an emerging national network of collectively managed research library resources. If you look at the UC Library's shared print program statement, it's very similar. To create more diversity and comprehensiveness in our collections by not focusing on duplicating them, but focusing on making them more diverse. Space savings and other cost avoidance, reallocation of library space, and we are definitely running out of room at UC, and then preserving the scholarly record. So those 4 elements appear over and over again, I think, in many of these initiatives. Space considerations, expanding access in some way, ensuring preservation, and then leveraging economies of scale in some way. And then there might also be a digital overlay. Within a collaboration, though, the relative importance of these goals can differ among libraries. And so in the case of Library A, they may put more emphasis on preservation because perhaps they consider themselves a library of record. And as you know, in the U.S., we don't have a national library, so that role falls to the largest research libraries. They're the ones who take responsibility for, I won't say never throwing anything away, but for trying to take that responsibility. Library B, on the other hand, might be more interested in providing, in reclaiming their space. And so their emphasis might be more on keeping materials that they need to use right now for their students and faculty, and they're less concerned about taking the role of preservation, even though they're concerned with preservation. So within a collaboration, if you're all mostly like Library B, for example, you might not want to invest a lot in validating copies for preservation purposes, and that can factor into the business model. It's also important to understand the distinction between shared storage and shared print archiving. And we sometimes talk about these things in the same way. Shared storage is a way of dividing up a particular space among depositing libraries. So they're taking advantage of, again, that economies of scale. Shared print archiving, on the other hand, is where libraries make a specific retention commitment. And so, that becomes part of how the whole thing is organized, and then it allows libraries the opportunity to make decisions about what they keep or what they choose to buy. And there may be some validation involved there. So this is an example of how shared storage and shared print might play out in terms of different aspects. You can see that for shared storage, the emphasis is really on the individual institution. They're deciding what to deposit. They may have a quota or a certain amount of space, but really what they put in is by and large up to them. They decide how on what frequency they might deposit, sort of a one-to-one relationship. Whereas for shared print archiving, it's really about the collective decision-making, defining a retention period. Ownership might even be transferred to another library, and I'll talk about that a bit more. The pace of space reclamation can be predicted up front because, again, it's done collectively, and then there is probably going to be some kind of collective management focus. And then all three of these types of shared collections can coexist in the same facility. In fact, in our shared facilities, we do have these types of collections that live together happily in one building. So once the goals are established, then of course it's important to know what is it you're sharing, what do you know about your collection. And I think this is rather interesting that we're learning more about our collections to help us make these decisions. This is focused on journal holdings because, again, that's what we've been dealing with West. At the network level, we now can look at the average number of libraries that hold a print serial title, 9. I mean, that's sort of an unreal, I mean, it doesn't relate to anything in reality, but it's that average number. We can just use that as a data point. We can go down to more specific subsets of journals, those that are in Portico, and that number of holding libraries goes up to 250. It's a smaller subset of titles. And then with an even more defined set of JSTOR, you see that more libraries hold that, and again, it's a smaller subset of titles. So those kinds of statistics can help us think about what we want to emphasize in a collaboration. For West, we looked within the region. We looked at journal families, which were taking into account title changes and the like. And so we determined how many journal families were held by 5 or more of the members, 3 to 4, and then 1 to 2. And then we used that to make some of our decisions. It might also be important for an initiative to look at some discipline data. In this case, this is just an example of thinking about how much of the journal literature has online equivalents, and 40% of the refereed journal literature is not available online, which might be a little surprising, but that's what it looks like overall. If you go into a discipline, it changes a little bit. History, even more of that area is not yet online. But then for medical literature, not surprisingly, it's the opposite. Most of it is online. So you can imagine that an initiative focused just on medical literature would have a very different set of choices to make. This slide is a very interesting study that was undertaken by the Hottie Trust with the help of OCLC. And the reason it was done was to inform the business model for Hottie Trust. And the way the business model works is that all the materials in the public domain, the cost of those are shared by all the participants. And the costs relate to the cost of preservation and the cost of providing services. The second category is that if you own a copy of a work and another library owns a copy of that same work, you share the cost. And then if you have a unique title that no one else in the collective has, then you pay for that full freight. So that's why this analysis was done. But this citation here is from Dan Cohen, who happens to be the new executive director of the Digital Public Library of America. He's a historian, actually, and he's quite interested in the changes in library collections and especially the digital aspects of them. So he wrote a little piece on this, and he called these library profiles that were either left-leaning or right-leaning. And if you know anything about the University of California at Berkeley, you won't be surprised to see that it's left-leaning. But what that means in this case is that it's a fairly old university, at least by U.S. standards, and it has on the left a large number of titles that are held by only a few other libraries in the Hottie Trust, and there's about 80 libraries that are part of Hottie Trust now. And so it skews to the left when we analyze it against others in Hottie Trust. Whereas other libraries at the University of California have different profiles. Irvine is a much newer campus. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road profile of having a few titles that are held by only a few other libraries, but mostly they're in the middle there with a fair number of other libraries holding the same titles. Merced is a very new campus, and they don't even have very many books at all. So they have the right-leaning profile. So, if we're looking at digital surrogates to take into account in planning shared collections, understanding these differences among libraries and having the tools to do so is becoming ever more important. And in fact, Hottie Trust is going to begin an initiative to look at a shared print project for monographs, which I think is going to be quite challenging. Journals much easier. There's some things we're learning just by doing things on the ground that are surprising. As I mentioned, UC has been working with JSTOR to validate their titles to create an archive. And the work is being done at the Southern Regional Library Facility. That's where this photograph was taken. It's one of our high-density storage facilities that's located at UCLA. And when we started this, we thought that the older campuses at UC would be the source for the copies that we would validate and retain. But it turned out that the smaller campuses had the so-called best copies. They were not used as much. They hadn't been circulated. They were not damaged as much. And so sometimes, you don't think about that kind of thing in the beginning of a project like this. Librarians at Cornell and Columbia decided to do an analysis of what percent of their journals, their electronic journals, are being preserved. And I think we all assume that number should be fairly high by now, but in fact it was not that high. It was only 13 and 15%. And so this caused some rethinking of, again, various shared collection management approaches. So within West, we took collection knowledge, that the kinds of factors that we wanted to look like, that we wanted to use, and paired that with our goals and came up with this approach. And this is just the way we decided to do it. It's not necessarily the right way, the best way, and we don't know yet if it's going to be effective, but this is how we decided to do it. We created 3 categories, and they're based on the Olympic medal designations, just to make it easy to remember. These categories determine the level of effort we'll devote to creating the archive. So for bronze titles, these are the ones that are more widely held among members in the collective. They have adequate digital preservation, and we will keep them in place at the holding library. The library will just make a commitment to retain them, so they stay where they are. The silver category, these titles are less widely held. They have digital copies, but not necessarily with a preservation commitment. So we will do volume validation for these titles, but will not try to fill gaps necessarily. And then for the gold titles, they typically are in print only. They don't have digital surrogates. And for those, we will validate at the issue level, and we will try to fill in gaps because those are the most at risk. So this is another view of that. You can see on the left there the characteristics of the title, the risk level in the purple column, the validation status, our archive type labels, and then where they're located, the higher risk titles, the silver and gold, we decided that those should be in a storage facility that would be under more careful management and and conditions, whereas the bronze titles can stay in circulating libraries, or if they're already in a storage facility, that's okay too. So let me say a little bit about culture as another aspect to take into account. And in this context, part of the culture that I'm thinking of is your risk tolerance. So are you willing to do a little experimenting in these sorts of collection management initiatives, or do you need to have everything analyzed and carefully planned and know the outcome before anything can happen? Many of these projects actually undergo quite a bit of analysis. I haven't seen any of them that seem to be exceedingly experimental. But on the other hand, we're trying to do something that will have payoff, far into the future. So there is some element of risk in knowing whether we did the right thing or not. Another example is that sometimes people want to know usage data. Can we even get historic usage data for different types of collections? And if we can, how predictive is it of the future? So sometimes, we just have to say, well, we don't know, and carry on. One of the good things about a collaboration like WEST is that we have so many different types of libraries that it's pretty easy to find libraries who are willing to kind of be the pioneers and take the lead, and then others can follow as they feel more comfortable. Another aspect of culture is maybe who you want to be. And I think about this as, again, this idea of a collection of record. Is it just not in your mission or your culture to think about giving your collection to anybody else, no matter for what reason? Or are you more of a collection of utility where your mission is to provide what your students and faculty need right now, and it's fine to rely on others to keep things for the longer term? But what do your users care about? I know in our campuses, our faculty are very sensitive about our collections and how big they are and where they live. And so that also has to be taken into account. Or maybe they care most about access, and if that works well, it doesn't matter where the copies live, and convenience is a part of that. I actually saw a very conservative historian be won over by the argument that if we participated in these kinds of collection management initiatives where we were able to eliminate duplication that was not needed anymore in favor of being able to build richer collections and more diverse collections, then it was okay for us to get rid of some volumes. And it took a while to get him there, but he eventually saw that type of management could make sense. Collaborators, well, those cultural factors can come into play when you're thinking about your collaborators. Do you want to partner with those who have very complementary goals and maybe characteristics? We heard about the White Rose Consortium yesterday of 3 institutions that were very similar in many ways. These other kinds of factors, does size matter in terms of your collaborators, or the type of library? Proximity. Again, we heard examples of here in Hong Kong where everybody's very close together. It gives you certain advantages, but then we also heard about collaborations that are very widespread. And then something that we don't always think about is, what about those who want to join but don't have anything to contribute necessarily? How will you think about them? And I'll give some more examples of that. And one of the things we've had to think about is dealing with other consortia. So we formed a collaboration, and then we had consortia come to the door and say, can we participate? And so how are we going to treat them within this new type of collaboration? There have been a few examples recently of initiatives where they said, no, we don't want to deal with consortia. And they had good reasons for doing that, but again, just thinking that through. And then the kind of members who don't necessarily have collections or other resources to contribute but want to be part of the club, so to speak, want to be able to rely on what's being done in the initiative. And in our case, we did, for West, we do have that model, and they simply pay a fee. But that isn't appropriate in every case. And then the other types of collaborators may be external to libraries, but very important players. Bibliographic utilities, certainly we're using them for various things in these shared print initiatives. Specialized organizations like Hottie Trust, or in the U.S., the Center for Research Libraries has a certain role to play. Commercial services like Sustainable Collection Services, they're doing collection analysis. And then for the rest of you, national libraries, as I said, we don't have that particular factor in the U.S. Some of these collaborators can, while they're very helpful, they can also have their own agenda. And they may have some sort of explicit authority, as in the case of national libraries, or they may have implicit authority, as in the case of an OCLC, and they may want to direct or influence the project to meet their own priorities at their own pace. So, be ready to take that into account. Some of these specialized organizations are starting to compete with each other, we're finding. They're trying to attract some of the same participants, and they're trying to carve out a role for themselves in this space, and so that's leading to some interesting competitive issues. So governance and policy always has to be dealt with, and I think what we learned in West is that it was, before we figured out the governance model, we really had to understand what the roles were going to be of the members. And as I described earlier, we have this concept of archive builders and those who may contribute collections, and then those who are just members only. And so that helped us decide the governance structure. Participants also have to have incentives, and that comes into play, or could come into play into the governance structure. You get a seat at the table if you do a certain level of work in the collaborative. In the case of West, all the members pay a fee, but those who are archive holders get a discount on the fee, and those who are archive builders are compensated for the work they do to take in content from other libraries. And then CDL plays the role of administrative host, and so we're compensated for that. The governance usually has some sort of strategic level and some sort of operational level, and I think, this is just another view of how our member roles play out. And then within each one of those roles, they have certain responsibilities for what they do, and that is all spelled out within the organization. So in terms of the actual governance structure, yesterday we heard several people mention that lightweight governance is really important and leads to success, and that's probably a good thing to remember. I think ours is fairly lightweight. We have an executive committee made up of representatives of those three types of roles. We have a project manager. We actually have 1.5 project managers. We have an operations and collections council that gets more into the details and surfaces policy issues and the like. And then CDL plays the role of administrative host. We manage the agreements with libraries, and this is a grant-funded project, and so we manage the grant responsibilities. This is just an example of some of the policy issues that might need to be addressed. It's certainly not all of them. But we have policies relating to these things. Selection criteria, obviously. We had to come up with that framework for how we were going to decide which titles to focus on, where they were going to be held, as I mentioned. The retention commitment, obviously, is very important for shared print archiving. And then ownership. This is a really interesting one. if it's an archive holder, it's usually the original holder simply keeps what they already have. But in the case of titles that are where the run is being built, libraries are giving their copies to somebody else. And so our policy was that they would be transferred by gift. Libraries do this all the time. But then we ran into some university policies that got in the way. So we're having to work through that. Access and delivery, another important component, and with West we simply decided we would rely on existing mechanisms. We're using retrospective journals. We don't anticipate a lot of use, and so we think that the existing ILL and access systems are adequate, but we'll find out. We don't know yet. So a bit about infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure is already in place. Certainly we have high-density storage facilities in many places nowadays. There are some new initiatives that are formed around the building of new high-density storage. We have cataloging and circulation practices, we have delivery services, but there are a few new components that are being developed just for this purpose. And those would include collection analysis tools, some of which I mentioned earlier, registries, and various disclosure systems to record retention commitments primarily. So here you see that the Center for Research Libraries has built a registry called the Print Archives Registry, and in fact CDL was contracted by them to build it, so we built it. There's also a collection analysis component coupled with that. OCLC has been working on disclosure standards and practices, and they've done studies on how those are being used and what improvements there might need to be, etc. And of course they provide the resource sharing infrastructure. And you can see here a little bit of the competitiveness that I was mentioning earlier. Who's going to disclose what, at what level, and for what purpose? And so the disclosure part of this can be very simple. It can be just, well, this initiative is going to take responsibility for these 500 titles. Or it can go down into great detail about exactly which volumes and issues are being retained, what their condition is, what the preservation practices are of the holding institution. So I think some of the players are kind of sorting out who's going to do what in terms of disclosure. This is just an example of what paper, as we call it, looks like. This lists the different shared print archiving initiatives that have registered with it. And then the other tab would let you see the specific journal titles. And you can then see which initiatives are doing the same titles. So, you know, we're going to see this landscape emerge of maybe we're all doing the same ones, and at some point we're going to have to step back and say, well, we don't all need to do the same ones 7 times. And so, but we don't know yet until we do this kind of reporting how that might look. I think the next challenge is going to be the delivery systems and understanding whether they're good enough. I think for journals, as I said, they probably are, but when we get into monographs, I think that's going to be another area that will have to be carefully evaluated. So metrics, we talked about assessment and metrics a little bit yesterday, and this is, again, I think we don't know yet exactly what the right metrics are for these kinds of initiatives. The really provocative question is, how do we count shared collections? And you know, I think we're at the early stages of just kind of using what we have in our existing practices, but I think that will change over time. What level of quality is cost effective in terms of the copies that we choose to keep, and this relates to validation and how much we spend on validating. How do administrators view the costs and benefits? I know our administrators think this kind of, they're really interested in these projects. They think it's going to save a ton of money and space and all sorts of things. So of course we have to manage those expectations a little bit. but then also how do users view this, and the cost benefit to them is often reflected in their own time, their own convenience, and it's somewhat difficult for us to measure that. These are just this is sort of a grab bag of data, but these are some of the metrics that can help in forming and evaluating these initiatives. We know what it costs to store an e-journal in a service like Portico. We know what it costs to store a digital book in Hottie Trust compared to books in high-density storage, compared to books in the stacks. And those numbers come from a study by Paul Courant at the University of Michigan. And I've cited that in my paper if you're interested in it. UC did a similar study a few years ago, though we didn't publish it, and we got pretty similar numbers. So I think that's quite interesting. When administrators look at this, they get excited, unfortunately. We know the average size of a journal backrun, which can help in predicting certain aspects of a project. And then we're also keeping track in West of what it does cost us to validate copies, because that can be quite an expensive piece of these projects. So we do want to see how that can factor into our business model. Another type of metric is simply reporting progress toward your goals. And so for West, we defined 8,000 journal titles, 150,000 or so volumes over a period of 3 years, and we can see how much we've done to date and make sure we're on track, and we are mostly. And we can also look at these sort of benchmark subsets of things like Portico and JSTOR. How much of those collections are we covering? Some other aspects of metrics. On the left side there, in West, we determined that there was the potential, if we met those goals of the number of titles and volumes, there was the potential to deselect the equivalent of 1 million volumes across the project participants. But it's not required that anyone do that. It's an option. But on the other hand, it's one of the more compelling reasons for doing this kind of thing. And so how are we going to track that? How are we going to get people to report it, or should we? We haven't quite dealt with that yet. On the right, you see how it breaks down in terms of the roles that we talked about earlier and who's doing what. And it's a relatively small number of libraries that are doing the work and making the commitments. So that may be a cost-effective thing, but is it a good thing in terms of getting commitment and buy-in from the other members? I mean, maybe next year they'll say, well, maybe maybe we don't need to do this, and if they pull out, then it affects the business model. So what is the right level of getting people to feel like they're part of something and they're getting something out of it? And then that other category of non-members, sort of in this case, it just means anybody who can use these collections through, again, the usual means. Some libraries who are building archives are worried that there's going to be a lot more demand on their collections if they make it evident that they are going to keep a title. Will they then get a lot more traffic? And personally, I think they won't, but we don't have any data yet. So how are we going to track that to allay fears or to create fears? I'm not sure which way it will go. So those are metrics that we need to think about. So to wrap up then, I wanted to quote something that came out just a couple of months ago in Library Journal. It was an editorial. And the author said that these projects, meaning shared print archiving projects, mundane as they may seem, often dealing with ladders and shelving and acid-free cardboard trays, represent some of the most significant work taking place in libraries today. And I'm not sure I would have said that, but when he said it, I thought, okay, maybe so. And those responsible deserve a word of thanks for their yeoman efforts. So I think that part is true because it is a lot of work to do these projects. These are the elements I think need to be taken into account, but as these initiatives mature and we learn more about them, I think there's a real opportunity to investigate them more systematically and maybe to flesh out this framework to make it a little more sophisticated to help guide other initiatives as they form around different parts of our collections. So as I said, I was going to leave you with many questions and not very many answers. And I want to point out that a lot of the material in my talk did come from our shared print manager, Emily Stambaugh, who some of you may have run into. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Farley, for a very comprehensive framework to look at shared collections.